Arthur Sterling arrived at the sprawling gates of the Sterling estate 3 days earlier than his schedule dictated. He stepped into the grand marble foyer, his heavy leather travel bag still gripped tightly in his hand. He had not informed the staff or his family of his early return. Countless consecutive nights of corporate board meetings in another state had left his tailored suit slightly wrinkled, his posture exhausted, and his heart burdened with a quiet, persistent guilt. He simply wanted to find his wife, Ilara. He wanted to hold her, and perhaps finally apologize for leaving her isolated in this massive house for far too long. Instead, before he could even call her name, the sound of his mother's voice drifted through the partially open mahogany doors of the formal living room. "If that child draws its first breath under this roof," Eleanor Sterling stated, her tone devoid of any warmth, "I will personally ensure it never inherits a single piece of our legacy." Arthur froze in the shadows of the hallway. Inside the expansive room, Ilara stood near the edge of a vintage silk sofa. One of her hands was wrapped fiercely and protectively over her pregnant stomach. Her face remained strikingly composed, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremble against the soft fabric of her modest emerald dress. "You hold the power to erase my name from your guest lists," Ilara responded, her voice soft but unyielding. "But you possess absolutely no power to tear my child away from me." Eleanor offered a dry, hollow chuckle. "Your child? Let us be brutally honest, Ilara. We are speaking about the most calculated financial trap ever set for this dynasty." In the hallway, Arthur's knuckles turned bone white as his grip tightened on his travel bag. The late afternoon sunlight spilled beautifully through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden rays across the room. Yet the space felt exactly like a suffocating prison. Resting perfectly on the center of the glass coffee table was a thick, unsealed envelope. Beside it lay a stack of legal documents and an expensive gold fountain pen, arranged with terrifying precision. "Sign the documents," Eleanor commanded. "Pack your belongings today, accept the financial settlement, disappear from his life while you still retain a fraction of your dignity." Ilara lowered her gaze to the cold, printed pages. Then, she slowly raised her eyes to look at the older woman, the same woman who had offered her charming, affectionate smiles at every public dinner whenever Arthur was watching. Standing in the shadows, Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. In a single, devastating heartbeat, he finally understood. This grand estate had never been a sanctuary protecting his wife. It had been systematically and quietly breaking her spirit. Eleanor Sterling did not scream. She did not raise her voice even a fraction of an octave, and somehow that made the scene infinitely worse. Her cruelty did not crash into the room like a violent thunderstorm. It crept in like a freezing winter draft. She stood tall in her immaculate ivory suit, a string of flawless pearls resting against her collarbone, not a single strand of her silver hair out of place. "Sign it," Eleanor repeated, her voice smooth and dangerous. Ilara did not reach for the gold pen. Both of her hands remained firmly anchored to her belly. Beneath her palms, the baby shifted, a gentle, private flutter of life, as if the unborn child intuitively sensed the hostility filling the air. Eleanor leaned forward, resting manicured fingertips on the glass table. "You will leave this residence before the sun sets. We will handle this quietly. No dramatic scenes, no desperate calls to the press, no emotional manipulation. You will be provided with more than enough capital to start fresh in another city. A comfortable home, premium medical care, and absolute privacy." Ilara stared at the documents, absorbing the weight of the betrayal. "Privacy," she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor's smile was razor-thin. "Dignity." A quiet, broken laugh escaped Ilara's lips. It was not hysterical. It was not loud. But the sound pierced through Arthur's chest deeper than any agonizing scream ever could. "You dare call this dignity?" Ilara asked. Eleanor's expression hardened into stone. "I call it a profound act of mercy. From the doorway, Arthur squinted at the papers illuminated by the afternoon sun. He could not read every individual paragraph, but the bold headings were clear enough. Relocation protocols, non-disclosure agreements, complete waiver of all future marital and parental claims. Clauses designed solely for the protection of the Sterling Empire's pristine reputation. Nausea churned in his stomach. This was not a mother losing her temper in a fleeting moment of frustration. This was a calculated, legally binding execution. Eleanor had constructed a silent trapdoor and was attempting to shove his pregnant wife through it before he ever arrived home to notice. Elara took a long, stabilizing breath. For almost a year, she had endured formal dinners where Eleanor subtly corrected her vocabulary in front of the serving staff. She had maintained a polite smile during afternoon teas while wealthy cousins mocked her lack of designer clothing. She had wandered the echoing halls of this mansion, carrying Arthur's child, while every lavish room quietly reminded her that her presence was only tolerated when she remained invisible. That era of silence was now officially over. "You smiled at me warmly whenever Arthur was in the room," Elara said, the truth ringing clear in the quiet space. "You called me darling. You placed your hand affectionately on my arm when high society guests were observing us." Elara cast a brief glance at the legal contract. But the moment his car left the driveway, "You began calculating the exact monetary value of my erasure." The mansion fell utterly silent. Even the distant, faint clinking of silverware from the kitchen staff seemed to vanish completely. Eleanor straightened her posture. "You are an incredibly naive young woman who completely failed to comprehend the magnitude of the world you foolishly walked into." Elara's fingers curled tightly into the rich emerald fabric of her dress. "No," she replied with absolute clarity. "I comprehend it perfectly now." Eleanor pushed the gold pen an inch closer to the contract. "Then prove it. Be intelligent." Elara stared at the pen. For one agonizing, suspended second, Arthur's heart stopped. He terrified himself with the thought that she might actually pick it up, not because she agreed with the monstrous terms, but simply because she was exhausted, because carrying the crushing weight of daily humiliation becomes entirely unbearable when the person supposed to protect you is always looking the other way, because a woman can possess a lion's bravery and still feel completely and utterly alone in the dark. Elara's hand hovered above the glass table. Arthur could wait no longer. He stepped out of the shadows. His leather shoe struck the hardwood floor with a heavy, resounding thud. Both women snapped their heads toward the doorway. Eleanor's expression shifted first. A rare flicker of absolute shock darted across her features, only to be instantly swallowed and locked away behind her usual mask of extreme control. "Arthur," she stated, her tone entirely conversational, as if he had simply wandered in a few minutes early for a dinner party. "You have returned." Elara's face lost all its colour. However, the emotion washing over her was not profound relief at her husband's arrival. It was paralyzing shame. Witnessing that specific reaction completely devastated Arthur. He looked down at the stacked legal documents. He looked at the expensive gold pen. Then he slowly lifted his gaze to the woman who had raised him. His voice emerged as a low, dangerous gravel. "What exactly is this?" Eleanor elegantly folded her hands together. "This is simply a difficult, mature conversation that you were never meant to interrupt." Arthur let his heavy leather travel bag drop. The echoing thud reverberated violently off the high ceilings. "No," he corrected her, the reality settling into his bones. "This is a meticulously drafted contract designed to make my pregnant wife disappear." Elara lowered her eyes to the floor. In that one, minuscule gesture of defeat, Arthur finally saw the entire, horrific truth. This contract was not the initial wound. It was merely the very first wound he had actually arrived in time to witness. Elara did not shed a single tear. Strangely, that was what frightened Arthur the most. She stood utterly isolated in the center of that flawless, magazine-perfect living room, completely surrounded by gleaming hardwood floors, towering crystal windows, and antique furniture that no one was ever truly allowed to enjoy. One hand remained fiercely guarding her belly. Her other arm hung rigidly at her side, the fingers curled into a fist so immensely tight that her knuckles glowed white. Eleanor's gold pen rested silently on the glass, waiting. Waiting exactly as the entire Sterling family had been waiting, for Elara to surrender and vanish. Arthur took one slow, deliberate step into the room. "Elara," he whispered, his voice cracking. She did not turn to look at him. Her eyes remained locked onto Eleanor. For the very first time since Arthur had crossed the threshold, Eleanor's composed smile faltered. It did not shatter entirely, but it slipped just enough to reveal the cold panic underneath. "You both need to calm down immediately," Eleanor instructed. "This situation can still be managed quietly." Elara offered a terribly slow, deliberate nod. "Quietly," she repeated. Her volume was barely above a whisper, yet every single syllable landed with the weight of an anvil. "That is precisely what you demanded from the very beginning, is it not? Quiet dinners, quiet insults, quiet suffocating rules, quiet enduring shame." Eleanor's jaw locked. Arthur looked frantically between the two women, feeling as though every sentence Elara spoke was violently tearing open doors in his mind that he had spent months refusing to unlock. Elara shifted her body slightly toward Arthur, though she still refused to meet his eyes. "Do you have any idea what quiet actually sounds like inside this mansion, Arthur?" He could not form a single word. "It sounds exactly like your mother correcting my pronunciation in front of the kitchen staff, while everyone pretends they did not hear it," she continued, her voice remarkably steady. "It sounds like your wealthy cousins laughing discreetly at my emerald dress while you are too busy scrolling through corporate emails on your phone. It sounds like me confessing to you that I feel completely sick and isolated in this house, and you casually telling me that I simply need more time to adjust." Arthur's face went entirely rigid. The memories crashed into him like jagged shards of glass. Elaborate dining tables, polite, condescending smiles. Elara consistently staring down at her plate. His mother's soft, venomous critiques cleverly disguised as maternal concern. He had been present for all of it. He had heard enough to know better. He had simply, cowardly, chosen his own peace over her truth. Eleanor moved a fraction closer to the table. "That is quite enough," she commanded. Elara finally looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. "No, it is not." The atmosphere in the room fundamentally altered. It did not happen loudly or suddenly, but a massive psychological shift occurred. Elara extended her hand toward the glass table. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor observed Elara with a glimmer of dark satisfaction, prematurely believing she had won the psychological war. But Elara did not reach for the gold pen. She picked up the thick stack of papers. Page by individual page, she scanned through the ruthless contract that had been engineered to aggressively evict her from her own existence. Her eyes tracked across the dense paragraphs, detailing strict confidentiality, physical separation, financial payouts, and reputation management. Then, with incredibly careful, deliberate hands, she placed the documents back onto the glass. "I will not sign this," Elara stated. Eleanor's facial features sharpened into a predatory glare. "You are making a catastrophic mistake." Elara turned her entire body to face the older woman. "No," she replied. "My catastrophic mistake was ever believing I walked into a family where I could be bought." Those words hung suspended in the heavy air. Arthur felt them physically ache inside his chest. Eleanor let out a chilling, dismissive laugh. "You entered this legacy with absolutely nothing." Elara's hand moved tenderly over her unborn child. "I entered this house with myself." Eleanor closed the distance between them. "You can be legally forcibly removed from these premises." "Yes," Elara agreed, her voice developing a faint, betraying tremor. Only a little. But her posture did not yield an inch. "You possess the power to remove my name from the estate. You can tell your elite social circle that I was entirely inadequate. You can draft endless contracts. You can summon an army of corporate lawyers. You can stand in this magnificent room and pretend your wealth makes you a god. She paused. The baby fluttered again beneath her palm. Elara swallowed the lump in her throat. But you cannot take my child away from me. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. Her words shattered something foundational inside his soul. Not because they were screamed in anger, but because they were the absolute, terrifying truth. Eleanor's face drained of colour, replaced by a toxic, boiling rage. That child belongs to the Sterling legacy. Elara slowly shook her head. No. This child belongs to love, not to a surname. For the very first time in Arthur's entire existence, his mother possessed no immediate, razor-sharp comeback. Outside the towering windows, the golden glow of evening fully surrendered to the cool blue of twilight. Inside the mansion, every single object appeared astronomically expensive, flawlessly controlled, and utterly untouchable. But Elara stood rooted there, in her simple emerald dress, physically exhausted and heavily pregnant, directly confronting the monstrous woman who had attempted to erase her, and she did not retreat a single step. Arthur stared at his wife as if his vision had just been miraculously restored. She was not fragile. She was not helpless. She was not the timid, weak woman this entire household had continuously mistaken her for. Elara had been fighting a brutal, solitary war for months, and now she was finally standing her ground in front of them all. Arthur desperately wanted to reach out and pull her into his arms. He wanted to apologize 1,000 times over. He wanted to swear an oath, right there in that beautiful, suffocating room, that from this moment forward, everything would be entirely different. But as he moved forward, Elara took one small, deliberate step backward. It was a microscopic movement, just the faint whisper of her shoe sliding against the polished hardwood. Yet, to Arthur, the sound was as deafening and final as a massive steel door slamming shut. Eleanor immediately capitalized on that tiny backward movement. Like a seasoned predator, she struck the wound before anyone could bandage it. "Look closely, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with artificial smoothness again. "She has already begun the performance. Notice the calculated trembling, the wide, wounded eyes. Any moment now, she will shed a single tear and claim she endured all of this in noble silence, purely out of unconditional love for you." Arthur snapped his head toward his mother. "Stop." It was a single word. Frigid, razor-sharp, echoing the exact tone he utilized in corporate boardrooms when multi-million-dollar acquisitions were on the verge of collapsing. But Elara simply closed her eyes. The expression on her face was not one of relief. It was pure, unadulterated exhaustion. "Do not suddenly speak to her that way on my behalf," she said quietly. "Not now." Arthur stared at her, desperate. "Elara, I just heard exactly what she was trying to force you to do." Elara finally met his gaze, and the profound sorrow in her eyes struck him far harder than any screamed accusation ever could have. "You heard it only because you arrived home 3 days early," she stated. "You did not hear it because you ever bothered to ask." The grand room fell into a suffocating silence. Arthur could not draw a breath. Elara's voice remained soft, yet it possessed the strength of forged steel. "You did not hear me when I completely stopped speaking at family dinners. You did not hear me when your mother corrected my etiquette in front of the serving staff. You did not hear me when your cousins mocked my emerald dress. And I just sat there forcing a smile, as if my heart were not breaking." Arthur's facial muscles tightened as suppressed memories flooded his mind one after another. He recalled a lavish dinner under the warm glow of a crystal chandelier. Elara quietly pushing expensive food around her porcelain plate. Eleanor remarking, "Darling, that is simply not how we hold a soup spoon." Everyone chuckling politely. Arthur had smiled too, convincing himself it was easier than making the atmosphere uncomfortable. He remembered another evening, Ilara, standing anxiously in front of their bedroom mirror in a simple dress, asking, "Do you think this looks acceptable?" And Arthur, entirely consumed by emails on his phone, muttering, "It is fine. Just make an effort to fit in tonight." The words now echoed back to him like a physical blow. Ilara touched her stomach and kept speaking. "You did not hear me when I confessed that I felt utterly alone in this house. You assured me it was just a phase that would pass." Arthur lowered his eyes. He remembered that exact morning. He had been packing for a business trip. She had stood near the bedroom doorway, pale and drained. "I do not think your mother likes me very much," she had whispered. He had absent-mindedly kissed her forehead without even looking at her face. "She is just an intense woman," he had replied. "Do not take it personally." As if systematic humiliation were merely a misunderstanding. As if chronic loneliness were just a fleeting mood. As if his wife had begged for a lifeline, and he had handed her a corporate excuse. Arthur swallowed against the painful knot in his throat. "I truly did not know," he whispered. Ilara's lips trembled for a brief second. Then she nodded. "I know." 2 small words, incredibly simple, utterly devastating. They offered absolutely no forgiveness. They threw no wild accusations. They merely stated the tragic reality. He had not known, because remaining ignorant had always been the easier path. Eleanor aggressively crossed her arms over her chest. "This is precisely what I was referring to, Arthur. She is weaponizing your own guilt against you." Arthur turned to look at his mother, but for the very first time in his life, her authoritative voice sounded incredibly distant, remarkably small, and almost powerless. Ilara's raw honesty had forcibly unlocked his vision. He finally saw the Sterling estate for what it truly was. It was never a home. It was a theatrical stage where everyone strictly memorized their lines. Eleanor played the gracious, benevolent matriarch. The extended family played the respectable elite. The staff looked the other way because they had mastered the art of survival. And Ilara, pregnant and severely isolated, had been brutally forced to play the grateful, silent peasant. Arthur realized he had played his assigned role perfectly too. The perpetually busy heir. The husband who foolishly believed that a lack of shouting meant peace. The man who arrived home long after the house had burned down and still tried to call it love. He took another step toward Ilara, moving much slower this time. "I failed you entirely," he admitted. Ilara looked away toward the darkening windows. Her hand moved in a slow, soothing circle over her belly. "Our child does not need a sprawling mansion," she said softly. "They need a father who does not only show up after the humiliation has already happened." Arthur stood frozen, paralyzed by the absolute truth of her statement. Behind him, Eleanor offered no sharp retort. For perhaps the first time in her reign, she had absolutely nothing to say. The truth had finally shattered the room's pristine illusion, brought in by the very woman they had all assumed was too weak to fight. Arthur was still struggling to draw a complete breath when his eyes finally caught it. A hair accessory. A deeply carved antique wooden hairpin rested elegantly in Ilara's loosely gathered hair, its dark polished surface etched with intricate vines that seemed to catch the fading light. He had seen her wear it before, countless times. He had watched her touch it nervously during high society galas. He had noticed her trying to hide it when wealthy guests rudely asked about its origins. But he had never truly examined it, not until his mother did. Eleanor's cold eyes locked onto the wooden hairpin, just for a fraction of a second, but Arthur caught it. All the blood instantly drained from his mother's face, a visceral flash of pure terror, rapid, silent, and gone almost before it even materialized. Anyone else in the world would have missed it. But Arthur had spent over a decade in high-stakes negotiations, reading micro-expressions on the faces of ruthless billionaires. A tightening jaw, a delayed blink, a calculated breath. His seemingly invincible mother was completely terrified of that small wooden piece. Ilara noticed it as well. Her hand slowly reached up, her fingers grazing the carved wood. Eleanor violently straightened her spine as if someone had just yanked a steel cable attached to her back. "Where did you acquire that piece?" Eleanor demanded. Her tone was completely foreign now. It was no longer cruel, nor was it controlled. It was sharp, panicked, and entirely exposed. Ilara gently pulled the pin from her hair, letting her dark waves fall, and held the wooden object in her palm. "It belonged to my mother," Ilara answered. The temperature in the vast room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur looked sharply between his wife and his mother. "Why does that matter, Mother?" he asked. Eleanor's facial mask snapped back into place almost instantly, but the repair job was flawed. Something fundamental had irreparably cracked behind her eyes. "It does not matter in the slightest," Eleanor deflected smoothly. "I simply find its presence highly peculiar." Ilara's soft eyes narrowed into a fierce glare. "Peculiar?" Eleanor aggressively lifted her chin. Lower-class individuals often cling to trivial symbols to make themselves appear far more significant than they actually are. The pain that washed over Ilara's face was an old, deep ache. "My mother cared absolutely nothing about appearing significant to people like you," Ilara stated. "She worked." Eleanor remained dead silent. Ilara's thumb traced the carved vines of the wooden pin. "She scrubbed floors at luxury resorts. She worked grueling double shifts through endless nights. She came back to our tiny apartment smelling entirely of heavy bleach, with severely swollen ankles and hands cracked to the point of bleeding." Her voice softened, anchored by a profound love. "But she still cooked my dinners. She still reviewed my school assignments. She still taught me to never, ever bow my head to arrogant people who mistakenly confuse a massive bank account with actual character." Arthur stared at his wife in awe. An entire lifetime of struggle, resilience, and quiet dignity lived beneath those words, a life he had completely failed to ask her about. Eleanor's lips compressed into a cruel, bloodless line. "Tread very carefully, Ilara." Ilara lifted her chin, mirroring the older woman's posture, but with authentic strength rather than manufactured arrogance. "No," Ilara commanded, her voice shaking the very air in the room. "You need to tread carefully." Eleanor's desperate eyes darted back to the wooden hairpin. This time, Ilara did not hide it. She held it up, fully exposing it to the remaining light. The polished wood gleamed, a testament to surviving harsh conditions. "My mother wore this specific pin every single day," Ilara declared. "She always told me it was carved by someone who was never permitted to publicly claim what rightfully belonged to her." Arthur felt a sudden, icy realization wash over him. A dormant memory, previously dismissed as irrelevant, aggressively woke up in his mind. He recalled the abrupt, heavy silences at holiday dinners whenever the initial development of the Azure Grove Resort was mentioned. He remembered his mother hastily sealing envelopes when he walked into her home office. He recalled tense phone calls that were abruptly disconnected. He had always assumed it was merely tedious corporate business, old property disputes, or mundane financial matters. Now, standing halfway between his pregnant wife and his terrified mother, he knew it was something deeply sinister. "What was your mother's full name, Ilara?" Arthur asked, his voice steady but hollow. Ilara looked at him for a long, stretched moment. There was profound love buried somewhere in her gaze, but it was heavily obscured by layers of crushing disappointment. "Evelyn Hayes," she answered softly. Eleanor inhaled sharply. It was barely audible, but it was enough. Arthur slowly turned his head toward his mother. "You recognize that name?" Eleanor completely refused to answer. Ilara's fingertips remained gently pressed against the carved wooden hairpin. "My mother passed away while working overtime to pay for medical treatments. She desperately tried to hide from me," Ilara said, her voice echoing in the vast room. "If she ever stepped foot into the luxurious spaces where people like you believed she did not belong, it was strictly with a cleaning cart in her hands and agonizing pain in her spine." Eleanor's impeccable composure aggressively flickered again. Arthur took another deliberate step toward the glass coffee table, where the unsigned legal agreement still lay waiting. Suddenly, the pristine white pages no longer resembled a simple separation contract. They looked exactly like a desperate, calculated cover-up. Ilara's wooden hairpin was not merely a piece of rustic jewelry. It was undeniable proof that something they had viciously buried had somehow survived the dirt. And for the very first time that evening, Arthur completely understood why his mother had been so desperate to force Ilara out before he arrived home. Eleanor was not simply disgusted by the pregnant lower-class girl. She was utterly terrified of the woman carrying the child and the silent secret she wore in her hair. Eleanor's silence stretched on for far too long. That, in itself, was her very first confession. Arthur stood near the table, staring intensely at his mother, as if a complete stranger had just slipped into her designer clothes. The formidable matriarch who could easily intimidate an entire boardroom with one raised eyebrow now appeared completely trapped by a carved wooden accessory. "Say her name out loud, Mother," Arthur demanded. Eleanor's eyes darted toward him, venomous. "This is entirely absurd." "No," Arthur countered fiercely. "What is absurd is my wife holding her deceased mother's hairpin and you staring at it as if a ghost just walked through those doors." Ilara's grip tightened around the wood. The incredibly spacious living room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. The soaring ceilings, the multi-million-dollar art pieces on the walls, the silent staff hiding beyond the hallway. Absolutely none of it mattered anymore. Something ancient and unresolved was violently waking up in that space. Eleanor marched over to the antique bar and poured herself a glass of sparkling water. Her hand was steady, suspiciously, overly steady. Evelyn Hayes was a low-level hospitality employee, Eleanor stated coldly. A woman who explicitly understood how to maneuver through exclusive environments where she did not truly belong. Ilara's face went entirely rigid. Arthur turned sharply. "Do not finish that sentence." But Ilara raised one hand, her eyes locked on Eleanor. "No, let her speak." Eleanor looked back at Ilara with a practiced, chilling cruelty that had been perfected over decades. "Your mother scrubbed sweets. She also carried trays and offered desperate smiles to incredibly wealthy, powerful men. Women of that specific status learn very quickly exactly where the real power resides." Ilara's lips parted slightly, but absolutely no words emerged. For one agonizing moment, she was no longer the fiercely strong woman who had rejected a billionaire's buyout. She was simply a daughter, a little girl again, forced to listen to her deceased, hard-working mother be viciously dragged through the mud by someone who had never experienced a single day of actual hunger or physical labor. Then, Ilara straightened her spine. "My mother worked because survival demanded it," she said, her voice vibrating with suppressed fury. "She worked while dangerously ill. She worked while exhausted. She worked while incredibly arrogant people like you stared right through her as if she were a piece of decorative furniture." Eleanor's eyes flashed dangerously. She was absolutely not innocent. The words dropped like a concrete block. Arthur stared at his mother, his chest heaving. What exactly does that imply? Eleanor refused to look at him. She kept her piercing gaze locked entirely on Ilara. "Your mother managed to get incredibly close to the Sterling legacy long before you ever did. She was employed at the original Azure Grove Resort, and your father was there far too often." The room plunged into an absolute, ringing silence. Ilara's breathing instantly changed, becoming shallow and uneven. Arthur heard the shift in her breath and felt a sickening twist in his own gut. "What are you talking about?" Arthur demanded. Eleanor lifted her chin proudly, though her voice had finally lost its aristocratic polish. "The old Azure Grove property, the unfinished acquisitions, the missing financial logs." Arthur's mind raced. His father, the resort, the bitter, resentful tone Eleanor had always used whenever the Azure Grove expansion was mentioned, a tone that was far too deeply personal to be just a corporate real estate dispute. Ilara stared at Eleanor, thoroughly bewildered. "My mother never told me a single word about that." "Of course she did not," Eleanor sneered. "Women of her kind never share the entire truth. They prefer to leave little pieces behind. A wooden hairpin, a secret child, An unregistered claim, a permanent stain on a flawless reputation. Arthur forcefully slammed his open palm down onto the glass table. The heavy gold pen violently jumped. "That is enough!" Eleanor physically flinched. For the very first time in Arthur's entire memory, his mother actually flinched. Elara did not move a single muscle. Her eyes had welled up, yet she refused to let a single tear fall. "My mother passed away with absolutely nothing," she stated quietly. "No sprawling estate, no army of corporate lawyers, no powerful surname shielding her, just a mountain of medical debt, endless double shifts, and a young daughter she was desperately trying to keep alive." Eleanor intentionally looked away. That tiny, evasive movement effectively communicated far more than any verbal answer ever could. Arthur closed the distance between himself and his mother. "You did not despise Elara purely because she was working class," he said slowly, the pieces locking together. "You despised her because looking at her constantly reminded you of Evelyn Hayes." Eleanor's jaw locked tight. "And," Arthur's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper, "because Evelyn Hayes had a direct connection to my father." Eleanor's face hardened back into stone, but the raw panic bleeding underneath was impossible to hide. Elara gently touched the wooden hairpin, holding it as if it were the only warm, honest thing left in the freezing room. "So that is the real reason you needed me to disappear," Elara said. "It was not entirely about my baby. It was not entirely about Arthur." She slowly shifted her gaze to the unsigned legal papers resting on the table. "You were utterly terrified that I would eventually discover what my mother actually knew." Eleanor's eyes burned with malice. "You know absolutely nothing." Elara took one confident step forward. "No," she agreed, "but you clearly do." The massive mansion seemed to hold its collective breath. Outside the windows, the distant city lights began to illuminate the skyline. Inside, Arthur looked at his mother and fully processed the devastating truth with painful clarity. This nightmare was never just about social class. It was never just about a pregnancy. It was entirely about Evelyn Hayes. It was about his late father, and it was about a massive, scandalous secret that Eleanor had spent decades attempting to bury in the dirt, long before Elara walked through the front doors wearing the evidence in her hair. Arthur did not wait for Eleanor to construct another sophisticated lie. His eyes darted to a small, unassuming leather folder, partially concealed beneath a thick architectural magazine on the corner-side table. Eleanor lunged forward, moving with shocking speed. "Leave that exactly where it is," she snapped. Arthur froze, but his hand had already securely grasped the leather folder. The atmosphere shifted violently once again. Elara stood quietly near the exit, one hand shielding her baby, the wooden pin resting securely in her grasp. She looked pale, not from intimidation, but from the overwhelming realization that her mother's buried past was actively marching toward her. Arthur slowly opened the leather folder. Tucked neatly inside were faded photocopies of ancient property documents, several handwritten corporate notes, names heavily circled in aggressive red ink, and a slightly torn vintage photograph. Evelyn Hayes, Azure Grove Resort, original property transfer, unregistered equity claim. Arthur read the faded words once. Then he read them a second time. His voice emerged rough and broken. "What exactly is this?" Eleanor's eyes turned completely merciless. "Confidential family business." Elara took one incredibly careful step closer. "My mother's name is inside that folder." Eleanor glared at her. "And that fact does not make it any of your business." Elara flinched internally, but she absolutely refused to break eye contact. Arthur pulled out the torn photograph. It displayed the original Azure Grove Resort near the coastline, back when its exterior walls were freshly painted white. Standing near the grand entrance was a very young Evelyn Hayes, wearing a standard housekeeping uniform, her hair neatly secured by the exact same carved wooden hairpin. Standing right beside her was Arthur's father. They were not physically touching. They were not smiling for the camera. But the physical proximity between them was just close enough for the image to radiate the heavy, undeniable energy of a shared secret. Arthur felt his stomach plummet into an abyss. "This is the Azure Grove property," he confirmed aloud. Eleanor said absolutely nothing. Elara stared intensely at the photograph. Her breathing began to shake. "My mother repeatedly told me that specific resort was a deeply special place," she whispered. "She never explained why. She only ever said, 'Some places always remember the actual people who built them, even when the wealthy families try to forget.'" Eleanor's face twisted with pure disgust. "That manipulative woman filled your childish head with ridiculous fairy tales." Elara looked directly through her. "No. She filled my life with grueling work, with incredible survival, and with absolute dignity." Arthur pulled out another fragile page. It was an old, heavily folded letter, unsigned. But the sharp, distinct handwriting unequivocally belonged to his father. He did not read it out loud immediately. His eyes frantically scanned across the faded ink, and with every single sentence he absorbed, his facial expression mutated, moving rapidly from confusion to profound shock, and finally to crushing shame. Elara watched Arthur intensely. "What exactly does the letter say?" Arthur swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. "It says Evelyn possessed a rightful equity stake in the Azure Grove property." Eleanor turned her back to them. Elara went completely, astonishingly still. Arthur continued, his voice barely hovering above a raspy whisper. "It says the resort would absolutely not have survived without her initial capital, her local connections, and her relentless labor. It says formal, binding promises were made." He slowly lifted his gaze to look directly at his mother, and then deliberately buried. Eleanor's voice cracked like fragile glass. "You possess absolutely no comprehension of what actually occurred back then." "Then enlighten us," Arthur demanded. Eleanor said absolutely nothing, and that suffocating silence provided the ultimate answer. Elara's hand slowly rose to the wooden hairpin. For years, she had genuinely believed it was merely a rustic memory of her mother, a small, insignificant piece of love passed down from a woman who had absolutely nothing else to give. Now, it felt incredibly heavy. It felt like undeniable proof. It felt like a stolen inheritance. It felt like a voice crying out from a forgotten grave, finally reaching the ears of the living. Eleanor took a desperate step toward Arthur. "You are willing to completely destroy this dynasty over a deceased housekeeper." Arthur looked at his mother as if he had never actually seen her true face before. "No," he replied, his voice chillingly calm. "You already accomplished that." Elara slowly closed her eyes. A single tear finally slipped down her pale cheek. She did not cry because she was weak. She cried because somewhere deep inside her soul, the little girl who used to watch her mother come home completely exhausted every single night had just learned the devastating truth. Her mother had never been invisible. Her mother had been systematically erased, and the incredibly wealthy family standing right in front of her had orchestrated the entire erasure. The grand mansion was entirely silent now. The documents lay violently exposed. The vintage photograph trembled in Arthur's grip, and the dark secret Eleanor had meticulously buried beneath offshore money, high society manners, and imported marble floors had finally broken violently through the surface. The Azure Grove Resort did not exclusively belong to the Sterling legacy. A massive portion of it rightfully belonged to Evelyn Hayes, and through her bloodline, it legally belonged to Elara. Elara did not reach for the leather folder. Not immediately. She stood in the very center of the opulent living room, one hand fiercely pressed against her pregnant belly, the other closed tightly around the carved wooden hairpin that had suddenly become infinitely heavier than solid gold. Arthur held the old photograph, his face completely drained of color. Eleanor stood frozen near the antique bar, stiff and pale, looking exactly like a criminal watching a locked vault being opened from the inside. Elara looked at both of them. Then she looked down at the immaculate glass table. The brutal agreement, the proposed financial settlement, the demanded silence, the neat little corporate plan to quietly remove her before the truth could ever take a single breath. And something fundamental inside Elara settled. It was not burning anger. It was not a thirst for revenge. It was something profoundly stronger. It was absolute clarity. I require certified copies of every single document in that folder, Elara stated. Her voice was remarkably calm. Arthur looked up, startled. Elara! No, she interrupted him gently, yet firmly. Not later. Not after your corporate attorneys sanitize the files. Not after your mother crafts a narrative in a way that legally protects this family. Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits. You have absolutely no idea what kind of fire you are touching. Elara turned fully toward the older woman. I know precisely what I am touching. She stepped closer to the glass table, moving slowly and carefully, as if every single physical movement had to fiercely protect the unborn child inside her and the deceased mother, who was no longer there to speak for herself. I am touching the legacy you maliciously stole from my mother. Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin white line. That woman is deceased. Elara's eyes flashed with quiet fire. Yes, she agreed. And that is exactly why you escaped justice for so long. The words struck the room with the force of a physical blow. Arthur slowly lowered the vintage photograph. For the very first time in their marriage, he did not attempt to interrupt her. He did not try to manage the situation. He did not try to fix it. He simply stood there and absorbed the truth. Elara picked up the unsigned legal contract, the exact same pages Eleanor had pushed toward her, as if a woman's human dignity could be easily purchased with a discreet bank transfer and a separate zip code. Elara read the first page again. Strict confidentiality, immediate physical separation, no future claims, no public statements. She offered a small, bitterly sad smile. This was never about protecting Arthur, Elara said softly. She looked directly into Eleanor's terrified eyes. And it was never about protecting the baby. This was entirely about burying Evelyn Hayes for a second time. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Elara placed the contract back onto the glass table. Then, with incredibly steady hands, she physically slid the documents as far away from herself as possible. I will absolutely not sign away my voice. Arthur's eyes filled with something dangerously close to profound shame. Elara finally looked at him. She truly looked at him. You asked me once why I did not share more stories about my mother, she said. Arthur said nothing. Elara's voice softened, but it absolutely did not weaken. Because every single time I brought her memory into opulent rooms exactly like this one, people instantly made her smaller. A maid, a poor woman, a mistake, a rumor, a name people could only say with pity or profound disgust. She gently touched the wooden hairpin. But she was my mother. She worked until her hands physically cracked. She loved me fiercely when she had absolutely nothing left to give. And if she helped build that resort, if she was formally promised equity, if her name was systematically erased, then I am completely finished allowing arrogant people to dictate what her life actually meant. Eleanor stepped aggressively forward. You will profoundly regret this. Elara turned to her with quiet, unshakable fire. No, Mrs. Sterling. I already profoundly regret remaining silent for this long. The room went entirely still. Even Arthur seemed to stop breathing. Elara calmly picked up her purse from the vintage silk sofa. Her hands were visibly trembling now, but she made absolutely no effort to hide it. True courage did not mean she was unafraid. True courage meant she was terrified and choosing to leave anyway. Arthur moved desperately toward her. Where are you going? Elara paused near the grand doorway. To meet with the attorney who originally represented my mother. Eleanor's face fundamentally changed. Just a fraction, but Elara saw it. Arthur saw it too. And after confirming that fear, Elara continued. I am going to learn my own history from the very beginning, not from your family's toxic whispers. Not from powerful people who label the truth a scandal simply because it makes them legally uncomfortable. Arthur's voice completely broke. Elara, please. Allow me to come with you. She looked at him for a very long moment. There was undeniable love still lingering there. But love was simply not enough tonight. Not yet, she answered. The words were gentle, yet devastatingly final. Our child does not need a father who frantically chases me only after the truth has been forcefully exposed. They need a father who can stand completely still long enough to actually confront the wreckage. Then, Elara walked out. There was no theatrical shouting. There was no dramatic collapse. There was just the steady, rhythmic sound of her shoes crossing the marble foyer. For the very first time since she had entered the Sterling estate, she was no longer silently begging to belong. She was taking back what had always rightfully been hers, her name, her mother's honor, and her own story. Arthur did not run after Elara. Every single cell in his body desperately wanted to. His feet were already angled toward the hallway. His hand was half raised, his mouth slightly open with her name sitting heavily on his tongue. But he physically stopped himself, because for the very first time in their relationship, Elara had told him exactly what she actually needed. She did not need a dramatic rescue. She did not need an empty speech. She did not need another corporate promise delivered far too late. She needed him to stand his ground and face the darkness. So Arthur turned slowly back to Eleanor. The living room looked entirely different now. It was the exact same imported marble, the same expensive glass, the same perfect furniture. But the room no longer radiated power. It felt entirely exposed. Eleanor stood near the antique bar, one hand wrapped desperately around a crystal glass she had not taken a single sip from. Her face had regained its physical shape, but it had entirely lost its intimidating strength. Arthur walked back to the table and picked up the leather folder. "Who else is aware of this?" he asked, his tone utterly devoid of warmth. Eleanor looked away. "That is not your concern." Arthur let out a short, completely humorless laugh. "My pregnant wife just walked out of this mansion carrying my child because you actively attempted to erase her existence, and you still foolishly believe you hold the power to dictate what concerns me." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "You are being overly emotional." "No," Arthur stated, with absolute, terrifying calm. "I am drastically late." That single sentence landed perfectly. For the very first time in her reign, Eleanor possessed absolutely no ready answer. Arthur opened the folder and intentionally spread the documents across the glass table. The vintage photograph of Evelyn Hayes, the handwritten corporate notes about the Azure Grove property, the ancient transfer documents, the buried equity claim. Then, he calmly pulled his phone from his pocket. Eleanor's voice turned hard and desperate. "What exactly are you doing?" Arthur completely ignored her. Calling Victor Vance. Eleanor stiffened instantly. That specific name carried immense weight. Victor Vance was the Sterling dynasty's senior legal advisor, the brilliant strategist who had flawlessly handled the family's multi-million-dollar property deals for more than 2 decades. He possessed a calm voice, wore exceptionally expensive suits, and kept incredibly clean hands while managing extremely dirty work. The call connected on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Sterling," Victor answered smoothly. "I was not expecting—" "I require a comprehensive, immediate audit," Arthur interrupted. A heavy silence followed. Then, Victor carefully cleared his throat. "Of which specific division?" "The Azure Grove expansion project." "All of it," Arthur commanded. "Land history, original ownership documents, unregistered private agreements, property transfers, initial renovations, offshore payments, deeply sealed files. Absolutely everything." Eleanor lunged forward. "Arthur, terminate that call immediately." Arthur looked directly into his mother's panicked eyes. "And I want it conducted entirely independently," he continued into the phone. "Not through our usual internal office, not through any individual possessing loyalty to my mother." Victor's tone fundamentally changed. "Tread carefully now. That is an incredibly severe request." "It is a direct order," Arthur snapped. Eleanor's crystal glass slammed onto the wooden bar with a sharp, violent crack. You are making a catastrophic error that could permanently damage this family for generations. Arthur finally lowered the phone slightly. No, Mother. I am finally investigating whether this family damaged someone else first. Victor remained silent on the line. Arthur could vividly hear the sound of papers frantically being shuffled on the other end. The sound of a powerful man suddenly realizing that the safe, sanitized version of his career was permanently over. There may be profound legal sensitivities, Victor warned. Arthur's jaw tightened into a rigid line. There is a pregnant woman who was just handed a vicious silence contract in my living room. There is a deceased woman whose legal name is maliciously buried in our property archives. And there is a multi-million-dollar resort built entirely on stolen documents my wife was never supposed to see. Arthur paused, letting the reality sink in. So do not ever lecture me on sensitivities. Eleanor's face drained to a sickly, absolute white. Arthur turned toward the towering windows. Outside, the sprawling city lights stretched across the darkness like thousands of quiet, watching witnesses. I am officially assuming direct, absolute control of the Azure Grove project, effective immediately, Arthur stated into the phone. No document moves without my explicit authorization. No board statement, no press leak, no private meetings. Send written confirmation to my private server within 1 hour. Victor hesitated for only a second. Yes, Mr. Sterling. Arthur ended the call. The massive room plunged into a silence so incredibly heavy, it seemed to physically press against the walls. Eleanor stared at him, utterly appalled. You would actually choose her over your own blood. Arthur looked down at the vintage photograph of Evelyn Hayes, then at the unsigned silence contract. Then he looked back at his mother. For decades, I foolishly believed blood signified loyalty, Arthur said softly. Tonight, I learned it can also signify toxic silence. Eleanor's lips physically trembled with unadulterated rage. She will completely destroy you. Arthur slowly shook his head. No. She already saved me. He picked up the leather folder and held it firmly against his chest. He did not hold it like a weapon. He held it like a profound responsibility. For the very first time in his entire life, Arthur Sterling was no longer blindly protecting the family name. He was finally questioning what it had ruthlessly cost. And somewhere out there, beyond those towering marble walls, Alara was walking alone into the dark night, courageously carrying the exact truth he should have desperately searched for long ago. By sunrise, the Sterling estate was eerily quiet. It was too quiet. It was the specific kind of suffocating silence that follows a devastating hurricane, when everyone inside the structure desperately pretends the foundational walls did not just violently shake. Arthur had not slept a single minute. He sat completely alone in his expansive study, the leather folder resting open in front of him. Evelyn Hayes's vintage photograph lay directly under the warm glow of his brass desk lamp. Right beside it lay the unsigned legal agreement Eleanor had attempted to force onto Alara. Every single printed page looked significantly more sinister in the harsh daylight. It no longer looked like corporate protection. It looked exactly like a premeditated erasure. At 7:12 in the morning, his private phone vibrated intensely. Then it vibrated again, and again. By the fourth consecutive call, Arthur already knew exactly what had happened. Eleanor had made her tactical move. The scandalous headline was everywhere before breakfast had even been served. Pregnant wife of Sterling heir abruptly leaves estate amid intense questions over family fortune. Arthur stared blindly at the glowing screen. The blood in his veins ran completely cold. Another aggressive article materialized mere minutes later. Anonymous sources claim young wife demanded exorbitant settlement before fleeing. Sources. That specific word almost made Arthur laugh out of pure disbelief. He knew exactly who the single calculated source was. The vicious articles did not mention the draconian contract. They did not mention the legal threats. They completely omitted the image of Alara standing entirely alone in the grand living room, fiercely shielding her unborn child, while the matriarch of the family attempted to wipe her from existence. Instead, the orchestrated narrative labeled Alara as emotionally unstable. It branded her as highly ambitious and manipulative. It heavily implied she had married into the Sterling dynasty far too quickly, secured a pregnancy even faster, and selfishly abandoned the marriage the moment her greedy financial expectations were firmly denied. Arthur stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair crashed into the mahogany bookshelf behind him. Across the sprawling estate, Eleanor was already seated in the sunlit breakfast room. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, her signature pearls perfectly resting against her collarbone. Her black coffee remained completely untouched, and a freshly folded newspaper rested right beside her porcelain plate, as if she had not just casually struck a match and thrown it directly into Alara's life. Arthur stormed into the room, tightly gripping his phone. "You orchestrated this." Eleanor lifted her eyes with agonizing slowness. "I aggressively protected this family." "You maliciously lied," Arthur countered. "I proactively corrected the narrative before she possessed the opportunity to fabricate one," Eleanor stated smoothly. Arthur's knuckles turned white. "She left this house because you attempted to purchase her silence." Eleanor's expression did not shift a single millimeter. "She left because women of her specific background fundamentally understand exactly when public pressure becomes highly profitable." Arthur stared at her for several long seconds. He truly did not recognize the woman who had raised him. Or perhaps he finally did. "You deliberately leaked this garbage to physically and emotionally punish her." Eleanor elegantly set down her linen napkin. "No, Arthur. I leaked it because the general public always respects the very first story it hears." The toxic words landed with sickening, calculated precision. Alara had barely escaped the mansion with the truth, and Eleanor had already meticulously wrapped that truth in suffocating public shame. Across the bustling city, Alara sat quietly in the modest waiting room of Dr. Alan Pierce, the seasoned attorney who had once desperately tried to represent her mother. Her phone rested face down on her lap. It vibrated relentlessly. She did not reach for it. She already knew what was happening. Distant acquaintances had started messaging her, some expressing artificial concern, some driven by morbid curiosity, and others offering the specific kind of condescending pity that feels exactly like another brutal insult. Her hands trembled gently over her stomach. The baby shifted, and Alara tightly closed her eyes. Not here, not now. She had fiercely promised herself she would absolutely not break down inside yet another room constructed by powerful individuals. Dr. Pierce gently opened the heavy wooden door to his office. He was significantly older than she had anticipated. Tall, remarkably thin, with completely silver hair. His tailored suit was visibly worn at the cuffs. When his kind eyes fell upon the carved wooden hairpin holding back her dark hair, his professional expression instantly softened. "You look remarkably like your mother," Dr. Pierce whispered. That was the exact moment Alara almost cried. Almost. But she swallowed the heavy grief back down. "My reputation is currently being dragged violently through the morning press," Alara stated as she walked into his office. "Eleanor Sterling desperately wants the world to believe I abandoned my marriage strictly for financial gain." Dr. Pierce's eyes darkened with recognition. "And did you?" Alara looked directly into his eyes. "Absolutely not." He nodded exactly once. "Then we must answer them incredibly carefully." Alara sat much straighter in the leather chair. "I do not seek dramatic revenge. I know. I do not wish to publicly destroy Arthur. I understand completely." Her voice shook slightly, but her vision remained crystal clear. "I simply want the actual truth to survive significantly longer than their fabricated lie." Back at the Sterling estate, Arthur immediately dialed Victor Vance again. "Absolutely no further public statements from this family. Arthur commanded. No more strategic leaks, no more anonymous sources. If one more article is published attacking Ilara's character, I will personally release the silence contract my mother attempted to force upon her. Eleanor suddenly appeared in the doorway behind him. Her face hardened into concrete. Arthur did not even bother to turn around. And Victor, Arthur added, his tone lethal, begin legally preserving every single internal communication tied to last night. A profound silence followed on the line. Then Victor answered incredibly quietly. Understood. Arthur ended the call. Eleanor spoke from the doorway. You would intentionally expose your own mother to public ruin. Arthur finally turned to face her. No, he corrected. You completely exposed yourself. Outside, the massive city was fully awake now. Thousands of vehicles moved through the congested morning streets. Millions of screens lit up. Countless strangers read the sensational headlines and blindly believed exactly what they were spoon-fed. But inside a small, unassuming legal office across town, Ilara finally picked up her phone. She read the vicious lies, one by one, her lips pressed tightly together. Then, she calmly placed the device onto the wooden desk and looked at Dr. Pierce. Help me draft a public statement, she requested. Her voice was remarkably calm now. She was not broken. She was not begging, because Eleanor Sterling had officially started a devastating war using toxic whispers, and Ilara was about to completely shut it down using absolute dignity. Ilara did not draft the statement in blinding anger. That fact profoundly surprised Dr. Pierce. Over the decades, he had witnessed countless innocent people destroyed by powerful dynasties. He had watched incredibly good individuals march into his office, physically shaking, absolutely furious, and entirely ready to burn every single name attached to their trauma. But Ilara sat quietly across from him, one hand resting protectively on her belly, the other lightly touching her mother's wooden hairpin. Her face was undeniably exhausted. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Yet, her voice remained perfectly steady. I refuse to sound exactly like them, she explained. Dr. Pierce looked over the rim of his reading glasses. Like who? Ilara glanced at the glowing screen of her phone. Like people who aggressively weaponize public shame simply because the actual truth is far too dangerous for them to face. The veteran lawyer leaned back slowly in his chair. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, he offered a deep nod of profound respect. Very well, he agreed. Then we keep the message completely immaculate. Ilara looked down at the blank notepad. The very first sentence took the longest time to construct. Not because she had absolutely nothing to say, but because she had far too much. She could have vividly described Eleanor's freezing tone in the living room, the crushing contract, the gold pen, the exact way Arthur walked into the room far too late to stop the initial bleeding. She could have loudly told the entire world that her unborn child had been directly threatened before it ever took its first breath. But she consciously chose not to. Revenge would have been incredibly easy. Maintaining her dignity required monumental strength. Across the city, Arthur stood frozen in his study as Victor Vance's written confirmation officially arrived in his encrypted inbox. Absolutely no documents would move regarding the Azure Grove project without Arthur's direct, written approval. A full, uncompromising independent audit had been formally initiated. Arthur read the legal email twice. Then, his private phone buzzed. Ilara's official statement had just gone public. He opened the link, his thumb already trembling violently. I have absolutely not demanded any financial settlement from the Sterling family. I have not entered into any negotiations for personal monetary gain. My sole priority remains the health of my unborn child, my own physical well-being, and uncovering the absolute truth regarding my late mother's historical connection to the Azure Grove Resort. I politely ask for strict privacy, while independent legal documents are thoroughly reviewed. That was everything. There was absolutely no insult. There was no wild accusation directed at Arthur. There was no dramatic, emotional attack. It was just enough factual truth to forcefully stop the fabricated lie from standing unchallenged. Arthur sat down slowly, the air leaving his lungs. Somehow, her profound restraint hurt him significantly more than pure, unadulterated anger ever could have, because Alara could have absolutely destroyed him in one single paragraph. She could have informed the entire world that he had been completely blind inside his own marriage. She deliberately chose not to. Eleanor entered the study without knocking. She had already read the statement. Arthur knew this simply by observing the razor-thin, furious line of mouth. "She is incredibly manipulative," Eleanor stated. Arthur slowly looked up. "She is flawlessly honest. She is legally positioning herself." "No," Arthur corrected softly. "She is fiercely protecting exactly what you aggressively tried to bury without ever becoming cruel like you." Eleanor's eyes flashed with pure panic. "You still do not comprehend how this high-level game works." Arthur stood up tall. "I believe I finally do." He held up the glowing screen. "You desperately fed the press a massive lie." She answered with one single factual paragraph. "Zero drama, zero revenge. And somehow she looks infinitely stronger than this entire dynasty." Eleanor stepped closer, her breathing uneven. "That statement explicitly mentions the resort. That will immediately raise massive questions." "It absolutely should," Arthur replied. Eleanor's face tightened with genuine terror. She could no longer fully hide behind her wealth. "You are deliberately allowing her to open a door that must remain permanently closed." Arthur's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "No, Mother. You violently locked that door on a deceased woman, and then you arrogantly attempted to lock it on her pregnant daughter." Meanwhile, inside Dr. Pierce's office, Alara watched the statement rapidly spread across the internet. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Major reporters, unknown international numbers, frantic messages from wealthy individuals who had completely ignored her existence yesterday and suddenly cared deeply today. She calmly turned the phone face down. Dr. Pierce studied her carefully. "You executed that flawlessly." Alara offered a faint, exhausted smile. "I do not feel like I achieved a victory." "You were not attempting to achieve a victory," he reminded her. She looked toward the office window. Outside, ordinary people crossed the busy street, holding coffee cups, carrying heavy grocery bags, gripping leather briefcases. Normal life aggressively moved forward, even when a powerful family's darkest history violently cracked open. Alara touched the wooden pin. "My mother spent her entire existence being spoken about by arrogant people who never once bothered to listen to her," she said quietly. "I will absolutely not allow them to do that to me." Dr. Pierce nodded deeply. Then he slowly slid a thick, aged folder across his desk. "There is significantly more you need to review." Alara stared at the heavy files. Her hand shook violently before she finally opened the cover, but she forced herself to open it anyway. Because the toxic lie had been successfully answered. The suffocating silence had been permanently broken, and Alara had learned something incredibly powerful that morning. She did not have to scream hysterically to be heard. She only had to speak the absolute truth and utterly refuse to disappear. Arthur genuinely thought the absolute worst truth had already been discovered. He was catastrophically wrong. By late afternoon, the independent audit team had begun aggressively pulling ancient files from physical locations the Sterling family had kept completely untouched for decades. Deep storage rooms, underground legal archives, heavily sealed boxes marked with polite, deceptive labels like historical records and inactive property escrow. But ancient lies absolutely do not sleep forever. They patiently wait. Arthur stood in the massive Azure Grove project office, his dress shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his expensive tie loosened, staring blankly at a towering stack of documents Victor Vance had just placed onto the glass conference table. Victor no longer looked comfortable or in control. His incredibly expensive, calm demeanor had completely evaporated. "There are massive material irregularities," Victor admitted quietly. Arthur looked directly at him. "Speak plainly, Victor." Victor swallowed hard. The original ownership records were illegally altered immediately before the resort transfer was finalized. Arthur felt the entire room aggressively tilt on its axis. Spread across the massive table lay a pristine copy of an ancient binding agreement involving Evelyn Hayes, a woman his entire family had casually dismissed as a hospitality maid, a wild rumor, a nuisance. But there it undeniably was: her legal name, her authorized signature, her financial claim. Arthur picked up the fragile page with trembling hands. Who specifically approved the physical alteration of these records? Victor hesitated. Arthur's eyes hardened into pure steel. Say the name. Victor lowered his voice to a terrified whisper. Your mother. The words did not explode loudly in the room. They sank, incredibly heavy, completely final. Arthur turned slowly toward the expansive window. Outside, the massive city moved fluidly, as if absolutely nothing catastrophic had just occurred. Vehicles, office lights, thousands of people walking home to their families. Ordinary, honest life. But inside his chest, an entire foundational belief system permanently collapsed. For decades, he had blindly trusted Eleanor's version of reality. Her strict discipline, her flawless elegance, her constant paranoid warnings about lower-class people who simply wanted to steal the family name. He had completely mistaken her sociopathic control for maternal protection. Now he finally understood the devastation. His mother had never been protecting the family legacy. She had been fiercely protecting a massive, calculated theft. His phone violently buzzed. Ilara. For one agonizing second, he only stared blindly at her beautiful name on the screen. Then he answered. Arthur, she said. Her tone was completely calm, yet heavy with exhaustion. I discovered something else too. He closed his eyes. What did you find? Dr. Pierce had carefully shown Ilara an ancient, handwritten letter from Evelyn, a letter that had never been mailed. In it, Evelyn had documented that formal financial promises had been made regarding the resort, that Arthur's father knew the absolute truth of her equity, and that she was profoundly terrified Eleanor would physically erase her before anyone could ever hear her side of the story. Ilara's voice trembled slightly on the final, devastating line. She explicitly wrote, "One day, my daughter may desperately need physical proof that I was not a liar." Arthur gripped the edge of the conference table so tightly his fingers went numb. He possessed absolutely no defense left. No corporate explanation was clean enough. No verbal apology was massive enough to cover the damage. Ilara, he whispered, his voice cracking. My mother illegally altered the ownership records. Silence hung heavily on the line. Then Arthur heard a small, trembling breath. It was not a gasp of surprise. It was pure, unadulterated grief. Arthur hated that specific sound the most. Ilara had already experienced so much profound pain in her life that even massive betrayal sounded completely familiar to her. And your father? She asked quietly. Arthur looked down at another faded document resting on the table. His father's distinct handwriting. Corporate notes regarding Evelyn. Deep regret permanently buried in ink. A massive financial promise half kept, then cowardly abandoned. He knew, Arthur confessed, the words physically burning his throat. He fully knew she possessed a legal claim. He knew exactly what my mother did, and he chose to stay completely silent. Ilara did not answer immediately. Arthur could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of city traffic through her phone. Perhaps from Dr. Pierce's office window. Perhaps from the wet street outside. For one suspended moment in time, they were absolutely not a husband and wife. They were two shattered individuals standing on entirely opposite sides of a powerful family's buried, unforgivable sin. Then Ilara spoke. My mother died genuinely believing that absolutely no one in the world believed her. Arthur lowered his head in utter shame. I am so deeply sorry. It sounded incredibly small, almost completely useless, but it was absolutely all he possessed. Ilara's voice softened, not with sudden forgiveness, but with profound exhaustion. This situation is significantly bigger than just the two of us now. Arthur looked at the mountain of stolen documents. Yes, he agreed, but I actively helped make it about us. Every single time I did not bother to ask you how you were. Every single time I cowardly looked away. Every single time I foolishly believed that a lack of shouting meant we had peace. Across the city, Ilara sat completely still, one hand resting on her belly, the other pressing down on her mother's handwritten letter. Her eyes filled with heavy tears, but she absolutely did not break. Arthur continued, his voice finding a new, solid resolve. I cannot instantly undo the massive crimes my family committed against yours, and I cannot magically undo what I personally failed to see in our marriage. But I can absolutely stop protecting the lie today. Ilara slowly closed her eyes. For the very first time since this nightmare began, Arthur was not desperately begging her to come back to the estate. He was not selfishly asking for her comfort. He was finally standing entirely still and facing the catastrophic wreckage. And that was undeniably the very first honest, mature action he had taken all day. Outside, the evening darkness began to fall once again. It was the exact same hour when Arthur had originally walked into the mansion and heard his mother Ruth ruthlessly threaten his pregnant wife. Only now, the darkness did not conceal the truth. It fully illuminated it. The emergency board meeting was strictly called for 8 o'clock the following morning. It was not held in the grand dining room of the estate. It was not held in Eleanor Sterling's private, opulent office, where she had aggressively controlled the entire family for decades, utilizing polished smiles and quiet, lethal threats. This time, Arthur specifically chose the entirely transparent, glass-walled conference room at the apex of Sterling Holdings. There were absolutely no oil portraits of ancestors. There was no antique silver tea service. There were no fabricated family memories hanging on the walls. There was just one massive cold table, 12 heavy leather chairs, and the unforgiving city skyline staring directly back at them. Eleanor arrived absolute last. Of course she did. She wore a flawless cream suit, her signature pearls, her hair sprayed perfectly into place, her chin lifted incredibly high as if absolutely nothing in the universe had shifted. But every single executive in that room already knew a massive earthquake had just occurred. Victor Vance sat rigidly near the far end of the long table, his eyes lowered, an incredibly thick, heavy folder resting directly in front of him. Two independent auditors sat completely silently right beside him, their laptops already open and glowing. The wealthy board members whispered nervously until Arthur confidently walked through the glass doors. Then, the entire room went instantly, terrifyingly silent. Arthur did not sit down. He stood rigidly at the absolute head of the table, the massive Azure Grove files stacked neatly and deliberately before him. For one brief moment, he looked exactly like the ruthless corporate titan Eleanor had aggressively raised him to be. Calm, intensely controlled, and terrifyingly powerful. Then, he opened the primary folder. My mother, Eleanor Sterling, is being permanently and immediately removed from absolutely all decisions, oversight, and financial access related to the Azure Grove Resort project, effective this exact second, Arthur announced. Eleanor's eyes snapped violently toward him. No one in the room dared to draw a single breath. Arthur continued, his voice echoing off the glass walls. She will no longer review any corporate documents. She will not authorize any internal communication. She will not contact our legal counsel. She will absolutely not speak to the press. And she will never represent this dynasty in any matter remotely connected to that specific property ever again. Eleanor let out one short, dangerous laugh. You absolutely cannot do that. Arthur looked directly at Victor. Victor nervously cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive glasses. Under the current corporate governance structure, Mr. Sterling possesses the absolute authority to assume direct oversight pending a formal investigation of massive material irregularities. Eleanor turned her lethal gaze on the lawyer. Victor. The single word was a profound, vibrating warning. But Victor absolutely did not fold this time. He looked down at the overwhelming evidence. The physical records fully support his decision, Mrs. Sterling. That specific sentence landed in the room like a heavy sledgehammer. Eleanor's flawless face fundamentally changed. It was not a massive reaction, but it was enough. The entire board saw the absolute terror bleeding through the cracks of her mask. Arthur calmly slid one aged document into the dead center of the glass table. This is a confirmed, illegally altered ownership record. He slid another page forward. This is a deliberately suppressed, legally binding private agreement. He slid a third page forward. This is direct correspondence explicitly referring to Evelyn Hayes and her legitimate equity claim to the original resort investment. Eleanor's lips tightened into a furious snarl. Evelyn Hayes was a low-level employee. Arthur's voice remained chillingly low, yet it carried across the entire room. She was a human being. The executives went completely still. She possessed a name. She possessed a valid signature. She possessed a legal claim. And according to these verified documents, this entire family fully knew it and chose to steal from her anyway. One of the senior board members shifted incredibly uncomfortably in his leather chair. Eleanor leaned back, attempting to project board superiority. You are foolishly allowing your unstable wife to completely poison your business judgment. Arthur looked at his mother for a very long time. No, he replied softly. My wife forced me to finally look at exactly what you ruthlessly trained me never to see. That statement hit significantly harder than blinding rage. Eleanor's mask completely shattered, revealing the panicked desperation underneath. You actually believe Alara is completely innocent. You honestly believe she just accidentally walked into this family wearing that specific wooden piece in her hair. You truly believe this is about love. Arthur rested both of his hands firmly on the glass table, leaning forward. I believe you maliciously attempted to force a pregnant woman to sign away her legal and human rights before I even arrived home. Absolutely no one in the room moved a muscle. I believe you cowardly fed the morning press a massive lie before the sun even rose. Eleanor's eyes flashed with absolute hatred. I protected our immaculate name. Arthur nodded incredibly slowly. Yes, that is exactly what you always call your abuse. He calmly opened the final, thickest folder. But fiercely protecting a corporate name is absolutely not the same thing as protecting the truth. Across the city, Alara sat quietly in Dr. Pierce's office, watching the entire board meeting through a highly secure video link Arthur had voluntarily sent her. She had absolutely not requested to watch it. He had freely offered it. There was zero pressure attached, zero demands for her to return. It was simply undeniable proof of his actions. Her hand rested gently on her pregnant belly as Arthur spoke the final, devastating words. Until the independent federal investigation is completely finalized, Arthur declared, Eleanor Sterling will possess absolutely zero authority over Azure Grove. Eleanor stood up violently, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This family will profoundly regret humiliating me today. Arthur met her furious eyes without blinking. No, Mother. This family is finally finished humiliating innocent people. For the very first time in her entire privileged existence, Eleanor Sterling possessed absolutely no room left to manipulate. There was no whispered order she could give. There was no hidden corporate lawyer willing to defend her. There was zero silence left waiting to protect her crimes. The formal board vote was taken. One by individual one, hands slowly rose into the air. They did not rise out of sudden moral courage at first. They rose out of sheer, undeniable fear of the overwhelming paper evidence. But they rose nonetheless. Eleanor remained rigidly standing as her absolute power slipped completely out of the glass room, quietly, officially, and permanently. On Ilara's glowing screen, Arthur did not offer a victorious smile. He simply gathered the heavy folders and looked directly into the camera lens for one brief, profound second. He did not look like a desperate man begging to be instantly forgiven. He looked exactly like a man who was finally, slowly, beginning to earn the right to ask for it. Ilara did not return to the sprawling estate. Not that afternoon. Not the following day. Arthur absolutely did not pressure her to. For the very first time in his life, he fundamentally understood that true love was not aggressively dragging someone back into the exact environment where they had been severely traumatized. True love was making absolutely certain the door remained unlocked and open, without constantly standing in front of it, blocking their view. So, they eventually met somewhere completely neutral. A small, quiet cafe located near the downtown courthouse. There were absolutely no imported marble floors. There was zero intimidating family portraits staring down at them. There was no household staff pretending not to hear their conversation. There were just simple wooden tables, warm amber light, the comforting smell of roasted coffee, and the gentle sound of rain tapping softly against the glass windows. Ilara arrived wearing a simple grey wool coat, one hand instinctively resting on her growing belly. The wooden hairpin was securely tucked beneath her collar, completely out of sight, but Arthur knew exactly where it was. He stood up far too quickly when he saw her walk in, then physically stopped himself from rushing forward. "Hi," Arthur said softly. Ilara offered a small nod. "Hi." So much massive, complicated history sat heavily between those two incredibly simple words. Arthur desperately wanted to explain absolutely everything. The intense board meeting, his mother's official removal, the ongoing federal audit, the massive stack of documents, the countless phone calls he had aggressively made to clear her name in the press. But Ilara already knew enough. And this specific meeting was absolutely not about him proving he had finally done the right thing. It was about him finally listening. They sat directly across from each other. For a long while, neither of them spoke a single word. The waitress quietly brought a cup of herbal tea for Ilara and a black coffee for Arthur. Ilara wrapped both of her hands around the warm ceramic cup, and Arthur noticed the slight, uncomfortable swelling in her fingers, the deep, exhausted shadows resting under her beautiful eyes. He had completely missed those incredibly vital details before. He silently vowed he would absolutely never miss them again. "I signed a lease on a new apartment," Ilara stated quietly. Arthur's chest tightened painfully, but he kept his voice completely level. "Is the location safe?" "Yes." "Do you require any physical or financial—" He abruptly stopped himself. The old version of Arthur would have blindly mistaken that question for kindness. Now, he fully recognized the inherent danger in it. Massive wealth could easily become a weapon of control if it was offered in the wrong manner. So, he carefully corrected himself. "I mean," he said slowly, "please tell me exactly what genuine support looks like to you right now, without taking away your freedom of choice." Ilara's cautious expression shifted just a fraction. It was not sudden forgiveness, but it was absolute recognition of his effort. "That is a significantly better question," she noted. Arthur nodded. "I am desperately trying to learn." Ilara looked out the rain-streaked window. An unknown man was gently helping an elderly woman across the wet, slippery sidewalk. Vehicles rolled past incredibly slowly, their headlights blurred beautifully by the falling rain. "My doctor confirmed the baby is perfectly healthy," Ilara said. Arthur closed his eyes for one intense second. A wave of relief crashed through his body so powerfully that his hands actually shook against the wooden table. "Thank God," he whispered fervently. Ilara watched his reaction closely. "Our son is doing fine," she added. Arthur's head snapped up. A son? The single word nearly broke him in half. A genuine bright smile formed on his face, but he deliberately stopped it from reaching too far. He knew significantly better than to selfishly turn her massive news into a moment about his own joy. Elara's hand moved gently over her stomach. I absolutely refuse to have him raised inside a perpetual war zone, she stated firmly. He will absolutely not be, Arthur promised. You cannot guarantee that just because your mother legally lost one single board vote. Arthur nodded, acknowledging the hard truth. You are completely right. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his hands flat on the table. I can only promise you absolute ironclad boundaries. Legal ones, personal ones. I promise you that Eleanor will possess absolutely zero access to you, to our son, or to any decisions regarding your lives, unless you explicitly authorize it. Elara studied his face intensely. And what about us? The question was incredibly quiet, yet it carried the weight of the world. Arthur looked down at his dark coffee. I honestly do not know, he admitted, stripping away all corporate arrogance. I love you profoundly, but I fully recognize that my love does not instantly repair the severe damage I completely ignored. Elara's eyes softened with profound sadness. No, it does not. I want to actively earn your trust, Arthur said gently. I absolutely will not demand it. Rain slid slowly down the glass window, separating them from the busy street. Elara took a deep, stabilizing breath. My mother spent her entire existence being aggressively forced to accept whatever powerful individuals decided for her. I will absolutely not live my life that way. You absolutely shouldn't, Arthur agreed. And I will not magically move back into that estate just because you finally decided to open your eyes to the truth, she added firmly. Arthur swallowed the lump in his throat. I know. For the very first time in their relationship, the heavy silence existing between them did not feel like a brutal punishment. It felt like necessary space. Space for immense pain. Space for absolute honesty. Space for something entirely new to take root, if it ever managed to grow. Elara reached slowly into her purse and placed a clean photocopy of Evelyn's handwritten letter onto the center of the table. I need you to read absolutely all of it, Elara requested. Do not read it tonight as a desperate husband attempting to win me back. Read it specifically as the son of the powerful man who cowardly chose to stay silent while my mother was erased. Arthur touched the paper incredibly carefully, as if the document were sacred. I promise you I will. Elara stood up a few minutes later. Arthur did not desperately reach for her arm. He did not beg her to stay longer. He simply walked her to the front door of the cafe and respectfully held it open as the cool, damp rain rushed in, chilling the air between them. Before stepping out onto the wet sidewalk, Elara paused. She turned slightly. You were incredibly late, Arthur. Arthur's eyes filled with hot tears. I know. She looked deeply into his eyes. But you are finally here now. Then, she turned and walked steadily into the falling rain, one hand securely resting over their unborn son, moving slowly but with absolute certainty toward her own independent life. Arthur stood quietly in the doorway and watched her walk away. He was not aggressively chasing her. He was not attempting to control her. He was simply standing there with the heavy letter gripped in his hand, finally, fundamentally understanding that true healing would absolutely not be a grand, cinematic reunion. It would be incredibly small. It would be brutally truthful. It would be agonizingly slow. And this time, he would have to continuously show up long before the hurt ever began. Several months later, the original Azure Grove Resort officially opened its massive front doors once again. It was absolutely not a grand event for wealthy investors. There were no flashing cameras or high society reporters. It was an intimate gathering exclusively for the actual people whose names had been systematically forgotten. Elara stood quietly in the center of the grand lobby, directly beneath the beautifully restored brass chandeliers. She gently held her newborn son securely against her chest. Arthur stood respectfully beside her, quiet, supportive, absolutely no longer attempting to aggressively control the moment. Mounted proudly on the stone wall directly behind them, a brand new, massive bronze plaque beautifully caught the morning sunlight. The Evelyn Hayes Memorial Foundation, honoring the dedicated workers who truly built this property with their bare hands, their immense sacrifice, and their unbreakable dignity. Ilara reached up and gently touched her mother's carved wooden hairpin, now resting securely in her hair once again. For the very first time in her life, the object absolutely did not feel heavy. It felt remarkably alive. Dozens of young, ambitious students wearing crisp hospitality uniforms filled the expansive lobby. Some of them came from families possessing very little money. Some had mothers who exhausted themselves cleaning luxury suites, fathers who worked grueling night shifts, grandparents who had carried generational pain entirely silently for decades. Now, their educational futures had a powerful name permanently attached to them. Evelyn's name. Arthur looked softly at Ilara. "I desperately wish I had seen the truth much sooner," he whispered. Ilara looked up at the gleaming bronze plaque, then down at their sleeping son. "So do I," she whispered back. "But because of today, he always will." The baby stirred gently in her warm arms. Outside the resort doors, the cool ocean wind moved steadily through the open archways. And inside that beautiful, restored space, the absolute truth had finally, permanently found a home.